let me just very briefly introduce Walter Bear. We keep one of the touchstones of the OII is we keep wanting to bridge government, business, industry, academia, and Wally Bear does all of that by himself. He worked with the White House Office of Science and Technology back in the days of Lyndon Johnson, and actually the whole concept of using communications to address urban problems was a major thrust, and actually led to some of the early visions of the role of cable communications and telecommunications for the social good. And after following that, Dr. Baer became, by the way, a physicist, not a social scientist, so he's also crossing disciplines, not just sectors. Became one of the early pioneers in discussing cable policy in the U.S. and outside of that, and in telecommunications. He became a member of the RAND Corporation and handled domestic research within the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica, California. He went on for a stint as strategic planning as a member of the Times Mirror Corporation, working, and I'm primarily involved with launching their video text trials and actual system in online publishing and online news and information, and then went back to the RAND Corporation and is now a visiting fellow at the Annenberg School for Communication, my old haunt, at the University of Southern California. And also you can see him or hear him taking calls for phone-in contributions to KCRW Public Radio in Santa Monica, California, I think. Or at least I remember hearing you when I lived in Los Angeles. And so anyway, from volunteering for local public radio to the White House Office of Science and Technology, you actually had an incredible career and influential in communications. And he'll be talking about public media in the U.S. And its future in light of internet and other new media developments. And really, really honored to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate your coming out on what is, I guess, a fairly rainy afternoon in August. As you can see, I've had a rather checkered career. One might say about half of my career time has been spent in academic or quasi-academic research at places like the RAND Corporation, and about half in business. And I've been interested for a long time in the intersection of technology and business and media and public policy, and that's really what I want to talk about here. I've also been, as Bill said, on the board of directors of KCRW, a public radio station in Santa Monica, California, which serves all of Southern California. And I'm going to use some examples from KCRW. But I really want to talk about the problems that our public radio and TV are facing in light of the growing number of people, particularly young people, who are using the internet to get their news, their information, their music, and the growth then of what we might call new media that is internet-based. What I'm going to talk about is in part based on my own experience and a lot of discussions with both the old media folks I know, including some people at the BBC, and interactions with students at USC and others who are involved in some of the new media, and also on work that we're doing collaboratively with the Berkman Center at Harvard and with the Center for Social Media at American University. And since my major theme is that public media of all sorts have to become not just more interactive, but more participatory. I want this discussion to be both interactive and participatory, and I hope you'll interrupt me at any time with questions or comments or arguments or examples from the UK or other places that I think would contribute. So, let me just start by giving a brief description of the public media, public radio and television enterprise in the United States. Then I'll talk about how the existing public media are trying to deal with the internet and the sort of projects that are underway, and then the kind of problems that I see we have to deal with. Actually, compared to the BBC, our public media enterprises are rather recent. It wasn't until, 40 years ago that there was a Public Broadcasting Act in the United States that established a corporation for public broadcasting, not as a government agency, but a little bit like perhaps the BBC, as a independent, non-profit corporation that was able to receive government funding. That was in 1967, soon followed by the establishment of the Public Broadcasting Service, which was a television network with a lot of rather independent stations that I'll describe briefly. And finally, the National Public Radio was established 3 years later in 1970. Now, they've been existing now for about 40 years, and surveys show that these are among the most trusted of U.S. institutions, business and political institutions. That hasn't declined, but what has declined are the audiences for public television, as they have here in the UK for the BBC audiences. For the public radio, the audiences are pretty stable. It's not as much erosion as in television, but still no growth there at all. The audiences are also aging, and this is a problem, and I think it's again a problem here and in other countries. And the young people in particular are showing much less loyalty to public media, either public radio or public television. And the fall off in audience is much greater among the young than among the older. Again, this is very similar to what's in the UK. I would love to hear more about the BBC experience, but what I can say is that from our perspective across the Atlantic, we're the poor cousin, and the BBC is this enormous institution that is funded with a budget of roughly 3.5 times the total of all public television and public radio in the United States. So we're very impressed with what the BBC has been doing in their online activities, and we're of course rather envious of the revenue base which it has received from the license fees. We can talk more about that later, but we do see, I see parallels between the experience in the US and the UK, but in the UK, the BBC being a much better funded institution than we have.
You probably, in terms of audience share as well, I mean, the BBC, the same trends, but it's going from a larger share of the audience, I suppose. I don't know what the
that's right.
share of public...
And actually, that's a good point. We're also seeing, besides decline, we're seeing the general fragmentation of the audience for both radio and television, particularly television. And this is largely due to events that I certainly championed in previous years, namely the ability to provide more choice in programming from cable and now satellite television. That has certainly happened, And in the United States, some 94% of households actually have signed up and are paying for either cable or satellite service. A very large number. We're also in the middle of the transition to digital television, as you are here, and that complicates things a little bit as well. But there is a fragmented audience due primarily to just the multiplicity of choices that are available to listeners and viewers. But in U.S. public television, I think, is particularly challenged because of the structure that was set up back in 1967. There are some 350 public television stations in the United States. They're very independent. In fact, localism, having local ownership and a locally independent structure for both public TV and public radio, was a U.S. policy goal after World War II, when television stations really were licensed. We then have a very decentralized system. There are independent stations, and in particular, there is no sort of centralized program production by the public broadcasting system, the way the BBC has such a large central programming operation. Instead, there are 9 major producing stations in the system, and I won't go into the details, but they're the stations that are in Washington, in Boston, in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Indianapolis. I think that makes 9, and they're all essentially in competition for funds. The funds flow primarily to the stations. And so there is a lot of bidding that goes on back and forth when, say, a documentary filmmaker has an idea for a new series or a new production. She has to, first of all, go to one of the producing stations. They have to then negotiate with Public Broadcasting Service and with the CPB if there's going to be any kind of federal money involved. The whole thing takes a lot of back and forth, and in my view is somewhat antiquated given the situation that they're facing. The result is it's fairly hard for new people to get on the air, particularly in the television side. And the system as a whole, I believe, is underfunded. Now, public radio has its problems, but it has some advantages compared with public television. First of all, there is a strong central programming group at the National Public Radio. NPR produces a good deal of its own programming, which are distributed to all of the 860 member stations. And in particular, the flagship programs are the ones that are on during the driving, commuting times in the morning and the afternoon. And NPR has a 2-hour program called Morning Edition in the morning, and then All Things Considered in the afternoon, that are nationally produced, distributed, and aired at pretty much the same times by the member stations. That's different from the public television case. And the results are that the national audience for the Morning Edition and All Things Considered is much larger than the typical public television audience. It's about 14 million listeners on an average day. Now that compares, if you will, to it's less than half of the number of people who watch American Idol. But on the other hand, it's nearly 5 times the audience that the nightly news hour gets on public television. So there is a large audience, particularly because of time that Americans spend commuting in their cars with the radio on. for public radio.
You never hear the drive time. I mean, you don't even talk about drive times in the UK. Also,
well,
it's the rail and
yes.
time. Yeah.
So this is an advantage for public.
Does it adapt itself over the time zones? Does it keep the morning program and the evening program fresh and refreshed over the 3 time zones?
Yes, I mean typically there are the 3 major or 4 major time zones,
yeah.
and so they will each carry the show at the appropriate drive time, let's say between 7 and 9 a.m. in the morning. Now, the programming on Morning Edition has been produced on the East Coast, but there are the news slots which are updated on a regular basis, on at least a half-hour basis, and the same thing in the afternoon. The other major advantage that radio has is that it's a lot cheaper to produce programming. And consequently, both it's easier to get the programming from sources other than NPR, which kind of keeps NPR on its toes. But it's also a lot cheaper to innovate, as I'm going to try to describe. And finally, public radio gets much less government money as a percentage, or needs much less government money than does public television. Public radio gets about 12% of the overall budget from the government, whereas public television gets 18 to 20%. And that can be a difference as well. So now I really want to turn to this question of, okay, so we all know that the internet is a major force. We all know that media is moving online. I want to give some examples from my station, KCRW, of what we've been doing. And we think we've really been an innovator in moving content online. We started our website back in 1995, which was pretty early. 2 years later, we started streaming channels on the internet, and we now have 3 24/7 channels. One is a simulcast with what's broadcast on air. The second is an all-news channel, which we get by adding to what National Public Radio produces with the BBC News that we license, with CNN and other news sources. So it is a 24-hour news service. And the third is a 24-hour music service. And again, because we're in Los Angeles and there's a lot of talent and interest in contemporary and new music there, that's one of the areas in which we really do focus. And we are able to get new music groups who will come in and perform on air for us. It's a big deal. It turns out that actually the music streaming channel is the most popular of, let's see, roughly we get 1.2 million users of the streaming service per month. Again, from public radio in the U.S., that's a fairly big number, given, again, that we're quite a fragmented system.
How many of these are foreign?
Well, that's we believe it's about 17% outside the U.S. Now, our on-air service is for Southern California, and our data suggests that that's about 40% of the online listeners are from our service area. Another 40% are from the United States, and 18% at this point are international. Points we can come back to later about so how do we make them regular listeners, and in particular since we only get maybe 10% of our budget. Our budget's about $20 million a year. About 10% of that comes from the government. We support ourselves primarily by asking our on-air audience to subscribe, to contribute. which we call begathons. Twice a year we get on and say, we need your support to keep us on the air. And partly from underwriting by both corporations and in Los Angeles a number of the arts organizations who will contribute, and their underwriting is then acknowledged on air.
What proportion of your budget goes into this category
Of online?
Yeah.
A growing proportion. And it's a very dynamic situation. And this is something that our board does discuss a fair amount. But we're very pleased and frankly excited about the fact that we have a large audience for the streaming channels. We also have a very large audience for podcasting. More than 1 million a month podcasts are downloaded from KCRW. And our website, which is a very active website, also gets well over 1 million hits per month. And this is growing, whereas our on-air audience has remained pretty steady. It hasn't fallen, but it hasn't been growing either. We have done some other things. We have developed a new media player. It's not like the BBC iPlayer, nothing of that magnitude, but it's a way to try to give an integrated listening experience for those people who are listening on the internet for us. We've also recently developed a interface to the iPhone so that we are now just beginning to distribute our content by cell phone, and we expect that to be a big thing in the future.
Wally, is the new media player, is that like through a consortium of public radio stations? Or just
It is not, and that is an
Wow.
issue. We've been, as I say, an innovator, and consequently we have not had many other stations that we have been able to use. And part of the issue in the United States is you have all of these independent stations, each of which is doing its on-air subscription drives. And while most of them don't overlap in their geographic area of broadcasting, they do begin to overlap when you start looking at streaming audiences. And so there still is a fair amount of competition, as well as plans and talk of more cooperation. But that's a big issue for us. Finally, we are using blogs as ways of extending the discussions that occur online, whether it's from our public affairs programming that we're producing, which is a very natural approach, to a very popular show called Good Food, which airs every week from the farmers market in Santa Monica, and turns out to have a very loyal following, not just in Santa Monica, but on the internet from the rest of the United States and overseas as well. The point I want to make is that we do have this growing online audience. It's now about 25% of our total on-air audience. That's a big jump over anything that we even thought we were going to get 5 years ago. We're very pleased about that. We're still uncertain as to how we make the best use of that online audience in terms of building the kind of network that we want. So we are, as I would say, in a perpetual beta situation where we are testing new things all the time and hope that at least some of them work. It's a very dynamic situation we're in. In fact, as we look ahead, we see that we really are moving toward what will be a network-centric future. I mean, 25% of the audience is online now. I don't know what it's going to be in 5 years, but it's certainly going to be a higher percent than we have now. And we're trying to integrate that online experience. We have a large archive of programs that are available digitally on our website. We're trying to make it a more seamless integration so that if you're streaming a music show and you come across a band or a song that you like, you can easily then find out what other music might be available on our website, or how you could actually download the song from iTunes or some other place. And we are looking to get sort of more active user participation. And this is the area that I really want to talk more about now, because what we've done is what I will call interactive services. Interactive in that the listener, the user, is able to, at her own initiative, decide when and what to hear, not be wedded to the program schedule. So we're interactive with podcasting, which many people are now using to podcast onto their iPods or other devices, bring those into the car, and instead of listening to Morning Edition, they will listen to the recorded podcasts that they already have. And one of the things we found with podcasting is that when we do video podcasts, and particularly the Good Food Show is an example, where we are showing videos, and now we can easily do this with the technology that's available. It's not that much more expensive to do. And with the music performances that we hold 4 or 5 days a week, those get a lot greater demand downloading than do the audio only. So one of the questions that this raises that I don't really have an answer to, if as we go forward it becomes easier and easier to produce video as well as audio, what's the future of radio? What does radio mean in a world where anybody online can get the video as well as the audio?
Can I ask, do you
Sure.
have different kind of intellectual property issues with video? And just to make a
We do.
slight point, I guess you can't predict very much about the future, but one thing that I hope you can predict is that people won't be watching video while they commute.
No.
It won't be the drive time.
Well,
for
that's
television.
again that's again one of the things I think that in a way protects radio compared to television, public radio versus public television. During drive time, you have this very large audience that one hopes is not watching video.
I've heard it happen.
I don't want to hear about it.
Not in the United States, but elsewhere.
But still, that fairly large group aside, there is all of the rest of the audience and the rest of the day, and the distribution over cell phone and over other devices that have the ability to show video, that suggests that that's going to be a larger portion of content that people, and again, particularly younger people, are demanding. So we all, people my age at least, remember the radio dramas that we listen to and feel that there's a real role for that. But how new generations will decide is another question. We are working to then try to develop our network, our community of listeners, to be more active participants and to form their own communities. For example, we've developed now links to Facebook for some of our programming. We've developed ways for users to basically send in photographs to Flickr and to tag them with KCRW and the particular show. For the Good Food Show is a good example, or one of the music shows. And all of this seems to be of great interest and working well, but we don't really know where it's going. I'll talk a little bit about the financial later. I want to defer that for now. But I would say that we are also moving deliberately because we still have a pretty traditional broadcast culture that's done very well for us so far. On the other side, there are the so-called new media, as represented by YouTube and Wikipedia, Facebook, Oh My News, the Korean group. You probably have come by and talked about that here. And how do they differ? Well, and I think it was someone from the BBC who said that it's really that you have audiences, or people formerly known as the audience, who want to participate. And there are at least 4 different aspects to this that I wanted to point out here. First of all, the users are producing their own content, user-generated content, UGC. It's an ugly symbol, but it represents the trend that I want to emphasize. YouTube is the good example where there are millions and millions now of user-generated videos on YouTube. The second one is users' participation, not just in the content generation, but in the editing and deciding what is it that's going to go on the traditional medium. And I want to give some examples of that, but maybe Wikipedia is the clearest one, in which users not only develop their own Wikipedia content, but they are making edits. And the system allows ordinary people to make those edits. And we're all familiar with the issues that have arisen from this, and how do you keep bad stuff from happening, and how do you try to, control it. And Wikipedia is I'm really not going to go into that, but it's a very important case study of how, starting from the notion that there didn't have to be any kind of controls over user editing, now has a system that's evolved and still is evolving, that and a community that is very supportive of Wikipedia and works to basically keep bad stuff off of the system. That's also occurring in the video side, and the Oh My News is an example of where there are citizen reporters that basically are providing most of the content there, and to some degree contributing to the decisions and the filtering of what actually goes back on the service. By many-to-many communication, clearly broadcasting is one-to-many. You could have one-to-one in the telecommunications side, and now we're finding the internet being used more and more, particularly through social networks, for getting groups who are interacting among themselves, not necessarily using the media source as the hub. And that's what we're trying to do at KCRW with our work interfacing to Facebook. Multi-platform distribution is clearly important, really, for all media, with, I think, an emphasis right now we're seeing on cell phones as the way in which so many people both listen and watch, something that wasn't certainly predicted, again, 5 or 10 years ago. So if I just, in a very oversimplified way, put up a matrix of what I'll call the old media, which is more of this top-down traditional structure, as opposed to the new media, which is more of a bottom-up participatory structure, and the for-profit and the non-commercial or government side, I want to focus really on the non-commercial side, because that's where the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, NPR in the U.S. fall, certainly where KCRW falls, and BBC. But they're all, at this point, more top-down than bottom-up. And in particular, if I look at those new media characteristics, and I look at the difference between what we're doing at KCRW and what Wikipedia does, oh my goodness, this is a funny symbol. I had a check in my chart here, and it comes out with this. But that's supposed to mean that the yes, this characterizes the service. So Wikipedia has user-generated content. It does have collaborative production and collaborative editing. It does have many-to-many communication. By and large, it's not doing multi-platform, but that's really not what it's after. Whereas at KCRW, we're doing some user-generated content, relatively little, but growing in terms of enlarging the participation on our blogs. We're doing now with the Facebook interface, starting some many-to-many communication, not using the station as the hub. But we're really not doing collaborative production where one person builds on the next person's content, nor are we doing collaborative filtering. And that's an area where I think not only we, but all of our public radio and TV, our pubcasters, have to look. Because the cultures are still very much ones that want centralized control. We're talking about, and really I believe we want to seek user-generated content, but we want to retain control of the editorial side as to what actually goes on the air. And by and large, while there are many exceptions, the people who run public media are not comfortable with the participatory production, filtering, and distribution models. That's oversimplifying, and as I say, there are exceptions, but I still think that's the primary characteristic. And the second point up there is that, in my view, interactive does not really mean the same thing as participatory in terms of where media are going. Now, an example of that is with the BBC. The BBC has lots of really high-quality interactive content, including the iPlayer, which is a terrific example of allowing users to get what they want when they want it. That's very interactive. But much less is what participatory in the criteria that I'd shown before. There was something called the BBC Action Network that was launched in 2003 as a grassroots online civic engagement initiative. And the idea was that users would generate the content for the Action Network. The BBC would provide some sort of general guidance, but the users were really going to be able to produce the content and decide how it would be used and such. It grew to about, as my understanding, about 1 million hits per month, but it was closed at the end of last year in favor of more of a news-driven service that would use the BBC news content and would have blogs associated with it, but would not have this essentially user generation and filtering aspect. Also, and I guess I really won't go into this now, I was interested when the BBC put forward the new statements of programming policy for 2008-2009, and they say, we will augment our news coverage with video, still images, and messages submitted by viewers where appropriate in order to offer first-hand accounts in a wide range of views. We aim to make it as simple as possible for audiences to make these contributions and create one seamless BBC News proposition across all platforms. Again, that sounds more what I would call interactive than necessarily participatory. On the U.S. side, we're seeing a lot of interactive efforts, podcasting, not just from KCRW, but most of the NPR stations. PBS has an online service, Kids Online, which has become very popular for age 6 to 11-year-olds, very highly used. And again, allows the kids and their parents to basically call up programs and play games and interact with characters from different PBS series. But it's all from the repertoire of content that has already been put up by PBS. There is a commercial service called Hulu, and this is jointly owned by News Corp and NBC, and it allows you to basically download video programming mostly free. It's mostly oriented toward commercial content, but there are now some, I think, 40 or 50 PBS programs that one can get on Hulu. To do that, you have to see some kind of advertising or underwriting before you can watch the program content, and that's certainly an issue in many ways for public broadcasting. There is now a PBS arrangement with BitTorrent for peer-to-peer distribution of some PBS programming. This is by and large for a fee, and it again is distributing programming that's already been produced in the traditional ways. One of the flagship programs for public television is Frontline. I would say it is one of the premier current events programs, and they have now put together a highly interactive website where the viewers are invited to, as they say, join the discussion, which means send comments back. The comments are moderated. Nothing goes on that hasn't been vetted by the frontline staff. And so I put this in the interactive rather than the participatory side. So let me turn to some models that I think are more participatory that are starting in the United States. The PRX in the radio, current TV, which is Al Gore's effort on commercial television. Vocalo, which is an interesting experiment started by Chicago Public Radio. Denver Open Media, which is coming from the public access cable world. And let me start with PRX. What PRX does is to try to provide an online marketplace so that the programmers who are not associated with any of the National Public Radio stations or NPR can find a way to get their content used on public radio. Here's how it works. Anybody who is producing an audio segment, they call them pieces, can upload content onto the PRX website. All you have to do is register. You can do this for free. You have to basically say that you own the rights to the content, that you're not saying any of the 7 dirty words or other things that would get you in trouble with the FCC, and a few other things. But once you basically click and say that, your content is uploaded to the website. There it is coded by category, which of course you can select the keywords for that. You as the producer also are able to select within limits the price at which you are going to charge for public radio stations to use the segment, the piece on air, and other terms and conditions that you would apply to it in terms of subsequent rights and so forth. Yes?
What percentage of those pieces that come on a Creative Commons license of one kind or another?
Well, for PRX, they are very much working with the Creative Commons templates, and that's what they basically are focusing on. Otherwise, I would say it's still not very strong in terms of the traditional NPR and member station programming. But PRX is trying to go in that way. So you get these pieces that are produced and are available. And my latest information is there are about 16,000 separate pieces now available on the PRX website that are intended to be auditioned by the member public radio stations and hopefully licensed to go on air. So any station can listen to any of the pieces that are up on the website. In addition, there's a rating system in which PRX has its own editorial board to basically provide its ratings of programs. And the stations can, if they want, their staff can do the rankings. And I can too, as an ordinary listener. I am registered on PRX, and I can contribute my ranking to any of the pieces. I have done that. And those are available primarily as an aid to the station programmers who want to decide whether to license something. So that a station programmer can basically search by either the topic, by the length of the piece, or by the rating, and can say I only want things that are rated 5 or greater. And then if the programmer decides, hey, well, this is something that's of interest, one click you can see the terms and the price of the licensing. And one more click you can say, yes, I want to get a broadcast quality MP2 downloaded for us to use on air.
Do many people just say use it for free, or how many people, what proportion wants to charge?
Most of the producers want to charge, and I think this is a validation that in fact what they're doing is valuable at this point, as much or more than actually thinking that they're going to make a great deal of money on it. It's usually a few $100s, that's the range. I think if you said you were licensing it for $100,000, you would not get any attention.
And sorry, how's payment then handled?
Payment is done automatically by PRX. If once I, as a station programmer, make that second click and say, yes, I want the audio, broadcast quality audio downloaded, then my account with PRX as a station is debited and the producer's account is credited. It's very simple. So there are about 460 of the public radio stations are registered users. There are about 2,600 independent producers who are registered producers. And those are current numbers, and more than 20,000 ordinary people, listeners, who are able to rank programming. It's new, and it has been supported by foundations and by NPR itself, but it seems to be working. They also have now a training program for young people to produce radio segments, and they received this last April a $500,000 award from the MacArthur Foundation, which they're using to develop an open source technical program that they intend to then promote freely, and to set up a social networking aspect of the.
Sorry, I missed
Sure.
the number. How many producers are registered?
The latest numbers that I got at the end of last month were 2,600 independent producers, are registered producers
And
with.
what proportion of the works that they register have actually been bought?
I don't know the answer to that. I know, as I say, that there's 16,000 plus pieces available, and I know it's an active marketplace, but I don't have those precise numbers. Probably you can get them from PRX. But this is, I think, an example of trying to increase the participatory nature of both the content production and the editing or ranking of content for use on air. Now, you asked the question earlier about rights and the difference between video and audio. I was at a meeting with the executive director of PRX, Jake Shapiro, last month, and I said to Jake, this is, I think, really a terrific thing you're doing, and we love it in public radio. How can you do the same thing for video? And he said, we'd like to do that, but the rights issues are so much more complicated with video. And I think, my response is, well, let's find a way to figure out how we can do it, and I hope we will have continuing discussions about that and that something may happen. But it is a much more difficult thing to consider doing on the video side.
There's a service in China that called Wangyu Media. I don't know if you've seen
I don't know that.
But it's very much like this, but it's all internet based, and it's mainly kids uploading video that they self-produce. But it's fun. I mean, it's not professional productions, but it's all rated by the audience sitting at their jobs, clicking in on their mobile phones what they like and don't like. And they make stars, literally. I mean, mega stars across China because they become singled out as really interesting celebrities. But I don't think they, and those are videos. They're video productions, but I don't think they sell. I don't think they have any. So I guess they avoid the licensing because it's free.
I think the video licensing issue will sort of come out in the wash over the years, because I've been talking to some producers who are already thinking about how can they produce programs that don't have, well, we call it in Britain the huge Bible of licenses for every little thing. You have a designer chair in your set, and you've got to have a license to use that designer chair. And if people are conscious from the outset of how to put together a program, a movie, or whatever, without those kinds of things in them, or have really easy licensing formats, which everybody's trying to get to, then it should get to be easier, but it is some way down the line.
I agree, and I hope that's the case. Let me turn to the video example that has some of those aspects. Current TV is a kind of a hybrid model of participatory media and a very traditional ad-supported commercial cable channel. It was developed by Al Gore, starting, I think, about 6 years ago, and Joel Hyatt, who's been his business partner on a number of things. And it basically went live 3 years ago in August of 2005. Current TV is a cable and satellite channel that uses mostly user-generated content, or much user-generated content, as its programming. It's targeted to this younger audience, 18 to 34-year-olds, that public television has been losing. But it's a commercial service that's ad-supported in a way I'll get to in a minute. So again, similar to PRX, essentially any user can upload a short video segment subject to saying that you've got the rights to it, it's not going to violate any existing laws or regulations. Again, there's a rating system so that users, viewers, can rate this as well as the paid staff of current TV. And there's a payments that current TV sets. Right now it's about $500 or so for each segment that is used on the cable channel. Now what's interesting also is that current TV emphasizes short segments as opposed to 30-minute or 60-minute programs. Its segments are typically between, well, I guess 2 and 13 or 14 minutes. They encourage short ones. They also employ what they call vanguard journalists who not only produce content on salary for current, but they serve as kind of guides for the users in terms of what sort of production quality is considered to be the level at which current is operating. And it's not what you might call network production quality or PBS producing station production quality, but it's not the YouTube production quality either. It's generally somewhere in between. It's been pretty successful in 3 years on the air. Now roughly 50 million households through cable and satellite get the service, and each of the cable systems or the satellite service that use current are paying a monthly fee to current TV for that service, similar to what all the other cable and satellite channels do. Of the 50 million, there are about 40 million in the U.S. and 10 million in the U.K. and Ireland. I don't know how many of you actually watch or know people who watch the current TV here. I do know in the U.S. that a number of the students I deal with and the children of friends of ours do watch current TV and like it. Current TV won an Emmy in 2007 for outstanding interactive TV service, and a Webby award in 2007 for the best television network website. It's ad-supported and with the affiliate fees from the cable and satellite channels. And probably the most interesting thing to me has been the emergence of viewer-created ads. This was not part of Al Gore's business plan. In fact, it kind of started as picking up a spoof on television ads that were put on actually other channels, and hearing that there was a buzz on the internet for these spoofs. And so Current basically experimented with having viewers produce ads, and it turns out that it's rather caught on, because the advertisers, even though some of the initial ones weren't altogether flattering for the advertiser, sensed that there was a great interest in their target audience of young people. And so it's been encouraged, and there's much more of the user-generated ads that are being produced, and payments of roughly $1,000, I think, that when they're picked up, and greater payments if the advertiser uses the idea or the ad elsewhere besides current TV. And it really does appear now to have some momentum of its own. Now, that makes some of my friends and colleagues in public TV and radio very nervous. It's not what they sort of see as what they want in their future, but it's a very interesting phenomenon that I think deserves our attention. I'll briefly just talk about Vocalo, which really turns the notion of traditional media upside down. It's not a public radio station with an active website. Rather, it's a participatory community website that happens to have a radio transmitter. It was developed by Chicago Public Radio really after its survey research found that while there were a lot of affluent, primarily white public radio listeners in Chicago, their service wasn't very popular among African Americans, Latinos, and other ethnic groups. They found in particular that the service that they broadcast to northern Indiana was not getting much attention or interest from this ethnically diverse audience. So they were pretty gutsy, and they said, well, let's see if we can kind of recreate a service from the bottom up. And so they have basically funded and set up a service that starts with a website on which there are some salaried hosts, but basically it's the users from the northern Indiana communities, Gary, Indiana, and surrounding areas, that are being not only encouraged to contribute their own narratives and their own stories, but there are active training programs that Vocalo is now providing at the community level. The Vocalo hosts run the web pages, and they basically also act as hosts on air. What Chicago Public Radio did was to take one of its translators. After you go about 35 miles from the main transmitter, you need another transmitter to basically serve an outlying area. And they had one in northern Indiana, and they basically said, we're not going to use this to translate or broadcast our own Chicago Public Radio service. We're giving it to this Vocalo group that they can use for the community-generated audio that they're producing. It's an interesting service. In addition to the on-air and the website, they also are supporting face-to-face events in these communities in order to try to nucleate and bring together people, create a community of listeners for a service that the listeners themselves are producing. It started about a year ago on air after several years of planning. It is funded by foundations and by Chicago Public Radio itself. I would say it's very experimental, and I don't know what its success is going to be. But it is an interesting example of trying to be truly participatory and not just interactive. I see my little folders or whatever those are there. But you can see again by the criteria that I had put down before, these examples, PRX, Current TV, Vocalo, really do have much more participatory aspects to them. And I think they are models that really deserve attention in looking ahead. So when I look ahead and say, well, what is the future for public media in the United States? In my view, not as any authorized representative of KCRW or any other, or USC or any other organization, all media are necessarily evolving toward becoming network-centered and distributing over multiple channels or platforms. That's commercial and non-commercial. I think that the technology is now not that difficult. It's cheap. It's in the hands of lots of people, particularly for younger people. They've grown up with the internet. They've grown up with cell phones, with cameras. They know how to use them. They can do tricks on them that seem like magic to me. That's the easy part. The hard part is really dealing with the existing structures and the people that have come up in a different environment. I think that the younger people who are comfortable with the internet want to be much more participatory than older generations. And that if public media are going to be successful, they've got to enable that participation. This is going to be difficult, and in particular, I think it really means that the established organizations that we have in the United States, and I suspect that may exist here in the UK and other countries, are going to face a lot of pressure to change, to become more net-centric over the years. And I would just say success is not guaranteed, but I believe that kind of change is a necessity in the new environment. So let me just end there and say I would be delighted with your comments and points that you'd like to raise as well.
Very good. Could I just raise a question about
Sure.
More about the content shift? In other words, you did say that the music channel, in terms of audio streaming, was more popular.
Yes.
But do you see any major shifts going on in terms of now that we know how many people are watching news, et cetera? And is news going to suffer in the new environment, or is it going to become more prominent, for example?
Well, I don't think I can give you a good example. First of all, I wouldn't believe anyone who told me that they knew the answer to that. So I'm not going to try. I mean, people want news and information. Now, they may differ in what kind they want and how much of it is what we would call hard news, in-depth news. But there is a great demand for it. It is coming now in a variety of new means. And I think I mentioned to you just a little while ago, in looking at my emails today, I got an email from the Obama campaign. It said, there's going to be a vice president selection fairly shortly. And if you want to be the first to know, just give us your email address and we'll tell you as soon as it's available. So this is if you will, non-traditional media way of getting information. It's just one example. I think a lot of younger people I know are getting news headlines on their cell phones all the time. I mean, I know that I get links to news stories on my email, and I use that primarily now, I would say, to find information that I don't get just by sitting down and reading a newspaper. I have to say, in dealing with my students, none of them pay to buy a newspaper. I mean, they will read a newspaper sometimes, but they don't read a newspaper the way I read a newspaper, to sit down at breakfast with a cup of coffee and really luxuriate over going through most of the sections. Instead, and outside of that experience for me, I mostly get my news during the day, sometimes by radio, but often by email with a pointer for saying, well, you really ought to look at this article that's in the New York Times, or this YouTube video that just came out. So there are just a lot more channels that are available, and I would say for that reason more fragmentation of the ways in which news comes to people. Now the big issue in the United States, since we don't have the kind of funding that the BBC has, is who's going to pay for the in-depth and particularly investigative journalism that previously and up to now has been the province of major newspapers and some PBS and NPR enterprises. If the revenue base continues to erode for newspapers and for commercial traditional television networks, where is the money going to come from to support that kind of investigative journalism? That's really another topic for another very extended discussion, and I don't have an answer to that. I know of some of the new projects that are going on in the United States to deal with that, but I would love to hear stories and comments from this side of the Atlantic.
Have you looked at all at, I mean, if you think of the NPR audience in the US, my suspicion is that it's a, you know, very, very much focused on a certain type of audience.
You mean affluent, educated,
and so on.
less diverse in ethnicity? Is that what?
Well, educated and you know, wanting that kind of highly educated news. Now,
Mm-hmm.
my question really was, if that's the case, to what extent does NPR radio especially need to address not the competition so much with mainstream US media, but with things like the BBC? Because I understand from the BBC people that after the UK, the main audience is the US.
Oh,
And you know, wouldn't those kind of be much more in direct competition? And if so, how would that competition play out? I mean, not so much in light of what you said just now in terms of the resources to pay for journalists, but in terms of, you know, where those two might profile themselves such that they can avoid direct competition. You see what I mean?
Well, first of all, I would say I'm not sure we want to avoid competition. I think competition generally makes the entities stronger, or if it doesn't kill them, it makes them stronger, as the comment goes. Also, the BBC, I think, has an audience because it does things so well on the news department. It is well endowed, and it produces very high quality journalism. And I think that the number of organizations around the world that do that are declining, and we should be championing those that do exist. I don't really see the conflict or competition as a bad thing, quite frankly.
No, I mean, but in terms of audience share, you know, you might be fighting for the same audience, and there's only a limited amount that any given
Sure.
audience can kind of
Sure.
take in. So,
Well, I'm not exactly sure how to respond to that. I mean, for a U.S. audience, while the BBC is highly regarded and in some respects has a cachet above that of the U.S. radio news, still it doesn't provide the kind of U.S. focus or some local focus that we'll get elsewhere. Secondly, as I mentioned with KCRW, we are providing a 24-hour news service, including the BBC, by licensing content. And we think that our news junkies like that because it provides them with some diversity of views, but it's obviously not all at the same time. It seems to me that's a perfectly reasonable way to proceed. But we are going to have to find, as societies, ways to support high-quality journalism in ways we haven't done before. And again, you can get now in a separate discussion of how much of that high quality work can be done by users, as one has seen in Wikipedia, where the general quality of Wikipedia, in my view, is pretty much every bit as high as the quality in other encyclopedias, and certainly more current. So there are lots of problems in thinking how you get users more participatory, but I think that we've got to look and see what ways are going to be productive there.
That's why I think the PRX model is particularly interesting, because it does have an editorial aspect built in. You know, it's not just turning public radio into YouTube, which no one would want, right? We don't.
Right.
It's just like public access TV in the 80s was terrible because there was a bunch of people in their basements producing terrible quality stuff. We don't want public radio to turn into terrible quality podcasts. I think an interesting parallel for PRX is that when you were describing it, it sounds to me a lot like microstock photography. You know, these microstock photography markets that let people contribute stuff that then stock agencies can buy. And it might be an interesting parallel because stock photography has been going through a lot of challenges because of digital photography too. A lot of professionals who used to make their living selling stock photography are having a difficult time making a living selling stock anymore because of all these microstock agencies.
Right.
People can sell 1 or 2 or 5 photos. So a professional who used to be able to make a lot of money at it. And I think that's going to be a similar thing if radio starts using things like PRX. Is it going to impact the professional radio producers who used to be able to make a living at it? Is it going to be more challenging for them if they're competing with these small programs that can be purchased possibly more cheaply than it is to produce This American Life or something, if someone can produce some interesting little bits? But I think it's an interesting model to see where it goes as a way of keeping editorial control without making it YouTube for the radio, which I don't think we want to hear.
Right. No, the stock photography model is a good one, and I appreciate that. I want to learn more about that.
Yeah.
That is, I thought that was the most interesting theme, this how to keep some kind of central editorial control despite moving to a participatory model. And I think that I find striking similarities that, to discussions going on in universities as well. But that is, how do how do we engage audiences, or we're clearly thinking of trying to expand audiences, not, I mean, many universities wouldn't necessarily let even people in the room to hear what's going on. So it would be expanding the audience, but also expanding who is able to speak, and but then not giving up. Where do you draw the line in terms of maintaining some editorial control, or can it be done? Yes.
There's always going to be tension there, and it is at this point quite a dilemma as to how you construct this. I have to come back to Wikipedia and just say that while I recognize the issues that Wikipedia has faced and continues to face, the reason for its, I think, continued success is it has built a community of loyalists who don't want to see the enterprise trashed. And so while it's still in principle possible to put in garbage and have it there, it ends up not being there for very long, typically because somebody in this community sees it and says, no, that's not what we want. Now, taken to the extreme, that can have some issues of its own, but it is a diverse community, and so it has some sort of self-correcting features to it. How we get that in other media, I don't know.
I think the challenge, I mean, Wikipedia, it's easy, I mean, it's factual content that lots of people can individually edit little itty-bitty constituent parts. And you can't, individually edit little constituent parts of a radio program or a television program and have it come out looking like anything even remotely interesting. So I think that's part of the challenge, right? Is Wikipedia and text of that factual nature lends itself, I think, well to crowds being able to fix all the little pieces. I don't think you could necessarily write a novel the same way. Wicked novel.
It's been tried.
Doesn't mean it won't happen, right?
Yeah, but at the same scale, you know, I don't think it would be as likely to work because it's a different.
And there are some open source film production.
Yeah, did
Yeah.
that ever work out?
Well, some of them are.
A Swarm of Angels, as
Yeah.
we've been studying that.
Yeah. Did they ever produce? I mean, did they finish it?
I don't think
What
it's
was the name
completed
of
yet. A Swarm of Angels, or
Okay.
Swarm of Angels.
Yeah, they were. It was all
So-
contributing ideas and then contributing to the movie. It was very.
Voting on the titles, etc. But they also had a benevolent dictator in that. They actually, their model is that they permit a lot of discussion, okay, of the title or of how to, people giving different film that they can integrate, but then there's the benevolent dictator who makes the decision about, this is be the title, this will be the, we all like that idea, but, but maybe that's, again, it's some way of balancing some type of managed editorial control with participation.
Well, because I think both BBC and NPR, I mean, they do add a lot of value through their high quality production and so forth. I mean, when podcasts first started, I listened to a few and they mostly weren't attractive to me. Now I do listen to a lot of podcasts downloaded from BBC and NPR because I get the professionally produced podcasts that are high quality and that I find worth listening to. And I think both of them need to be able to keep that level of quality engaged, even when they're letting maybe people produce more kinds of things, which is obviously not easy to do.
No, I mean, you have to have a system set up to try to do that. But I think also that the overall demands may range farther out. Some people may be very interested in a particular topic and be willing to compromise a bit on the audio or professional quality of the programming. I'm very interested in other models outside the United States or even the UK, and I would be delighted if any of you had pointers to other places and other situations that we ought to be looking at, because we certainly don't have many of the answers.
Well, it's not as innovative as some of the things you've mentioned, but I thought it was really fantastic. You're aware of Robin Williams, who's a broadcaster in Australia, and Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and he does interviews with scientists, artists, whatever, all around the world, and basically he's been doing this for maybe 20 years, and he has all the audio tapes from that, and they basically digitize that, and all of a sudden, what was very time-bound, very geographically bound in terms of access, is now accessible as podcasts, and they also then, and he's a great interviewer, and he does great editing of that, but then all of a sudden these little 5-minute interviews are all, and they can package those, like if people are interested in physics, well then they put together interview with Einstein with other people, and I mean, all of a sudden you really could see where new media enables older media to be much more powerful, much more archivable, much more, have totally global geography. Now maybe adding blogging to that, enables people to comment on various recordings, etc. I think it's...
I also want to emphasize the idea of having other voices that haven't been traditionally part of these program services. And, whether they're ethnic voices, whether they're particular communities that want to be heard, I think that's going to be an important part of this media future as well.
And I imagine the global voices.org
Yes.
itself will start moving into this space as well,
Right.
with adding, audio and video content. If they haven't already done so, I haven't checked.
Have you thought of digitizing old NPR broadcasts and making them available for podcast or?
Well, NPR is
Follow
in the
news
process
1967,
of doing more and more of that. I don't know whether there are any rights or other issues when they go back far enough that nobody had thought about this as a possibility. But yeah, making them available then you get to the question of how does anybody find them? How do you search for them? But those are reasonable issues that I think you can find solutions for. So yes, the move is in that direction. I think money is a limiting factor, time is a limiting factor, but certainly the body of work that is available digitally is increasing massively.
BBC ran into that kind of problem when they tried to license all the work of previous documentary films that were produced, trying to get down who the production company was and who licensed who. So that's why the project was not successful.
Well, we should finish soon, but I think that does raise this question. If you look at online access to information, not radio at the moment, but it's moved away from going to any particular place to get content to going to a search engine.
Yes,
to find
definitely.
And I think it's only a matter, I wonder if if stations will be able to hold on to any loyalty to I guess your model is that by having local content, you can hold a local audience, I suppose, as a portal to local, to news with some local content.
Yes, because of the community of interests that we are serving. But on the other hand, now we have, as I say, 17% of the online audience is from outside the United States, and we're delighted with that. Now, what I didn't talk about, and I don't think we have time to now, is how do we basically utilize this online audience to be part of our support network. Because we're very good at raising the funds we need from our on-air begathons. Although still it's basically 1 out of 10 or maybe 1 out of 8 of our listeners who actually subscribes in any way at all. That model doesn't seem to work very well online. And while there are some thoughts about how, what we and others might do, none of them are proved out as yet. And as we know from the newspaper side, the idea of having people pay for online content has not been a conspicuous success, hardly anywhere. So that, I think, is a real question for another conversation. I, of course, would welcome any thoughts that you would have on that one as well.
Could you just say how do you have a program of research, or you said you're collaborating with Berkman and others? I mean, is this actually, are you going to follow this up, continuing to follow this up with some kind of...
Oh, indeed, yes. I mean, we have some papers in development. There's now a lot of interest on this topic, clearly. And so there have been a number of conferences and are continuing to be as to how we move, as they say, beyond broadcasting. Yes, but I will certainly keep you informed when we have things coming out.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.